Hello and welcome to this course, How to Lead Virtual Teams. My name is Doug Gray, and I'm not sure, today's March 18th, I'm not sure if St. Patrick's Day even happened yesterday anywhere in the world. As you all know, the coronavirus has forced all of us to use virtual tools, and teams are critical as we continue to do our work together. To be clear, there's a bunch of different perspectives on this. One is that we've had virtual teams as long as we've had recorded history. We've always had a fiat from a king or some leader that was distributed to some dislocated or remote team, and then they did or didn't do that. But I think we've got a compelling argument for a lot of more significant changes. In fact, so leadership competencies are those measurable characteristics that are related to some of your success. There's typically different kinds of leadership competencies, and I'll show you a bunch of examples in a second. They're often related to behavioral skill. You have to do this. You have to show up on time every day. You have to respond in so many minutes to your clients. Or a technical skill. You're competent in that capacity to use that tool. Or an attribute, like you've got the intellectual capacity to deal with whatever. Or an attitude. I've talked about optimism several times because it's so critically important, and you can fake it till you make it at a neurobiological level. So there are 3 points here I want you to think about. I want you to imagine that you can assess your leadership competencies for your group, create a model that works, and then apply it. If you notice, this is what I've been talking about throughout this training, is leaders practice leadership. There are countless lists of leadership competencies. This is from one vendor called DDI. I'm not endorsing them in particular, but we do look for key digital competencies. And sometimes we can argue that these are new, or they're different, or they're dependent upon a technology or a certain client need. But that's really not always the case. So driving behavior, desired behavior, navigating a future, these are things that we've been doing forever. And sometimes we can create these colorful maps, a competency model map that is like an organizational chart or a spider web. And it looks at, to what extent do you hire for or develop for digital tech influence or experimentation mindset or commitment to a culture or focus on a positive future? It could be that those are higher, which is why they're farther away from the center of this map. And it could be that intelligence over emotional quotient, IQ over EQ, is not as. The point of a model like this is simply to take a snapshot of the strengths of the competencies that you think are important for your team, whatever they might be. And they'll vary by business, and they'll vary by organization. And then you can apply them. Here's a detailed image that looks at application by generational cohorts. You don't need to go this deep. Millennials, in fact, are 50% of the workforce. Gen X and Boomers are smaller percentages, but each important in various ways. When you think about digital literacy, your capacity to use virtual tools, or your capacity to lead, or your capacity to lead virtual teams, it could be that there's slight variability between those cohorts. But notice, it's slight. It's not very big on this scale of 1 to 5. I invite you to just try it. Just take a competency and try it. I've done this, and I invite you to think about the ways in which you coach those people. So I'm part of a couple of networks that are amazing, one of which is Coach Source. CoachSource.com has, you'll see, a network of 1,200 executive coaches in 55 countries. I happen to be an engagement manager with them, and I am able to manage for Fortune 500 companies. This is a survey that we did some years ago, and it looked at, why do people invest in executive coaching? In other words, the leadership competencies that they wanted to develop. And it was not primarily about leadership development, the first one. It's not about being in a new role. It's mostly about executive presence. That's the thing that we see most of the time. Those are the top 3. Sometimes we'll get the fix me engagement, the 4th one, or career coaching. Rarely life coaching. Now that's just their sample population. The point I want to encourage you to do is measure or assess the competencies in your organization. And if you don't have the means to do so, hire somebody like myself or others. We can measure leadership competencies, and then we can track them over time. So just as you go to your doctor and you get your vitals taken, you know, your blood pressure and your weight and your height and all those things, we can measure competencies of a team. And if George is not a good organizational fit for that team, either George needs to change or George needs to move. So there are task requirements, there's task difficulty that affects those competencies. And virtual teams, frankly, are easier to measure sometimes than direct teams because you've got more access to them and you've got more data, and sometimes they know it and sometimes they don't. Back to the IBM example of screen scraping. Other organizations like General Electric, well, GE, they won't screen scrape. It's an organizational norm. They just refuse to do so. So those metrics provide structure for virtual knowledge workers, like all of us. We're all virtual knowledge workers, to distribute resources. And the idea of pivoting is to go from here to here, not dramatically off, but to respond to a specific need, a specific competency. For instance, if I need to demonstrate empathy more for a specific reason, somebody's loss, well, that can be video recording. I could have other people provide feedback for me. If my competency relates to my capacity to articulate a problem, and I've got, I had a call this morning, there were about 10 people, and I could see their faces all on the screens, and I could ask them, to what extent am I able to articulate this problem? And I could get feedback from them in the moment. Well, we now can drive certain competencies, and that is a great way for us to excel. There are 3 buckets in talent management. We attract, we develop, and we retain key people. So those competencies, the top ones, according to the nerds, are worth writing down. I didn't put them on a bullet because I wanted to make this point. Learning agility is a thing. It's your capacity to learn new skills. It could be the reason why you're on this course. Superb communication skills is a thing. It's a competency. You can measure it, you can track it, you can see how it changes over time. Problem solving is a thing. I'm told that when Google was actively hiring, they had big billboards with a little formula, and it required a certain kind of problem-solving response. Some of these are online. They're very clever. You can find them. Assertiveness is a thing. Leaders and managers need to assert their knowledge and ask questions, ask what and how type questions. Tolerance of diversity is a thing. If you have a rigid mindset to, for instance, to anybody from a certain ethnic group or geography or red hair, I'm making it all this up, that will limit your capacity to excel in any organization. So think of these 5 as the top 5 leadership competencies that you could start with in your little list. And then I invite you to develop it, because that's what we do. When we have a virtual team, I always look for smart people who can solve problems. Those are my 2 criteria in hiring. But yours could be different, and probably should be. So we've just talked about practice tool number 6, or leadership competencies. The last one, number 7, is all about this point of multicultural communication. All right, there's 7 tools. The 6th